There is a moment in Goodfellas that nobody forgets. It lasts about 4 seconds. Eric Clapton's Layla is playing on the soundtrack, the slow, mournful piano instrumental break, not the electric opening riff. The camera holds on a refrigerated meat truck parked on a quiet street. The doors open, and there, hanging frozen between the hanging carcasses, is Frankie Carbone. His body is rigid, his face is blue-gray, his eyes are open. Henry Hill's voice comes in over the top, flat and almost bored. When they found Carbone in the meat truck, he was frozen so stiff it took them 2 days to thaw him out for the autopsy. 4 seconds. No explanation, no backstory, no name beyond Carbone, just the image and the voice. And then the camera moves on to the next body, because there are more bodies. There are always more bodies in the aftermath of the Lufthansa heist. That image has lived in the minds of everyone who has ever seen that film. The specific horror of it, not a shooting in an alley, not a body in a river. A man frozen solid, stored like meat, discovered by whoever happened to open those truck doors first. It is one of the most disturbing deaths in the history of American crime cinema, and almost everything about it is wrong. Here is what Goodfellas never told you. Frankie Carbone is based on a real man named Angelo Sepe. Angelo Sepe was not killed by Jimmy Burke. He was not frozen in a meat truck. He was not killed because he bought his wife a coat. He was shot 3 times in the head in his basement apartment in Brooklyn on July 18th, 1984. While his girlfriend was sleeping in the next room, they killed her, too. She was shot once in the open mouth while she slept. She never woke up. She was in her early 20s. She had no criminal record. She died because she was in the room. And the frozen meat truck that actually happened. But it happened to a completely different man, a man the movie never named, a man whose story is darker than anything Scorsese put on screen, a man who was hogtied, frozen, and discovered by children. This is the real story of Frankie Carbone, every layer of it, who Angelo Sepe actually was, what he actually did, how he actually died, who the frozen man in the truck actually was, and why Scorsese merged 2 entirely different murders into one 4-second image and a single line of narration, and in doing so gave the most disturbing death in Goodfellas to the wrong man. But here is what makes this story genuinely haunting. The real version of these events is not less disturbing than the movie. It is more disturbing at every single level. More violent, more cold-blooded, more senseless. The movie gave Carbone's death a reason. In reality, these men died for reasons that shifted and multiplied until nobody could track them. In reality, the killings after the Lufthansa heist went on for years, not months, years, and they reached people who had nothing to do with the heist at all. A girlfriend asleep in a bedroom. A woman named Teresa Ferrara, a Lucchese associate and FBI informant, whose dismembered torso was found floating in Barnegat Inlet near Toms River, New Jersey on the 18th of May, 1979, identified only through the serial numbers of her breast implants. A con artist whose frozen corpse had Jimmy Burke's home phone number hidden in the lining of his coat. None of that is in the movie. None of it could fit in 4 seconds. To understand the real Frankie Carbone, you have to start where Goodfellas starts. Robert's Lounge, 11445, Lefferts Boulevard, South Ozone Park, Queens, Jimmy Burke's bar. Jimmy Burke's crew. And inside that crew, one of its most trusted and most violent members, a man named Angelo John Sepe. Angelo Sepe, born January 14th, 1941 inches South Ozone Park, Queens. His criminal record began when he was 14 years old. 14 arrests by adulthood, running from petty larceny and burglary upward through assault and weapons charges. He was, as Ernest Volkman and John Cummings described him in their definitive 1986 account of the Lufthansa heist, simply and accurately an unkempt lowlife whose 14 arrests represented one of the most consistent juvenile and adult criminal records in the Burke crew. He was lean. He stood just barely over 5 feet tall. He dressed poorly. He cared nothing for appearance in a world where many of his associates cared about little else. And he had one quality that made him genuinely irreplaceable to Jimmy Burke. He would do anything without hesitation, without question, without remorse. He met Tommy DeSimone in prison where both were serving time for hijacking. DeSimone introduced him to Burke. And Burke, who was always looking for what he himself described as young men with violent tempers who knew how to use them when measures got drastic, recognized immediately what Sepe was. He brought him into the crew at Robert's Lounge. He cultivated him. He protected him. And within a few years, Angelo Sepe had become one of Burke's most reliable instruments of violence. Here is something the movie never told you about Sepe because it complicates the image. He loved animals. His home was full of them. Rabbits, birds, turtles, whatever stray came in from the street, Sepe took in. It is the kind of humanizing detail that feels invented but is documented in multiple accounts of his life. A man who killed without hesitation and kept pet turtles. A man who committed acts of extraordinary violence and fed stray rabbits in his kitchen. The mob produces these contradictions routinely, but Sepe's version of it is particularly striking. He married the sister of Tony Rodriguez, a Lucchese associate, creating a family bond that tied him more deeply into the crew structure. He divorced her later, which created tensions. He moved in with Joanna Lombardo, 17 years old at the time they began their relationship, a veterinarian's apprentice from Long Island City. He was in his late 30s. She was a teenager. He was also, by the late 1970s, consuming more than 2 grams of cocaine every single day. The drug use accelerated after the Lufthansa heist. The money was there, the stress was there, the paranoia was growing, and cocaine for Sepe was no longer recreational. It was structural. December 11th, 1978. The Lufthansa heist, one of the most precisely planned armed robberies in American history. The entire operation, from the moment the crew entered the terminal to the moment they loaded the van and drove away, lasted exactly 64 minutes. What they took that morning, $5.875 million in cash and $875,000 in jewelry, is equivalent to approximately $28 million in today's dollars. Jimmy Burke had assembled his crew at Robert's Lounge for months of planning based on inside information provided by Louis Werner, a Lufthansa cargo supervisor who owed $20,000 in gambling debts to bookmaker Martin Krugman, who passed the information to Henry Hill, who brought it to Burke. At approximately 3 inches the morning on December 11th, a crew including Tommy DeSimone, Angelo Sepe, Louis Cafora, Joe Manry, Paolo Licastri, and Robert McMahon entered the Lufthansa cargo terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport. They knew exactly where to go because Werner had given them detailed floor plans of the facility, the precise location of the vault, the times the security rotations changed, and the knowledge that one door in the double-door vault system had to close completely before the other could be opened without triggering an alarm. They were inside for approximately 1 hour. When they left, they had taken $5 million in cash and $875,000 in jewelry. At the time, it was the largest cash robbery ever committed on American soil. Sepe was one of the gunmen who held the employees hostage. A cargo worker named Kerry Wan was beaten during the robbery. When investigators showed Wan photographs afterward, he identified Angelo Sepe as the man who assaulted him. Sepe's Cadillac was later bugged by the FBI. A recorded conversation captured him referring to a brown case and a bag from Lufthansa. It was not enough to convict him. It was enough to confirm what everyone already knew. Within days of the heist, the bodies started appearing. The first was Parnell Stacks Edwards, 27 years old, who had been assigned to drive the black Ford Econoline 150 getaway van to a New Jersey junkyard, a facility controlled by John Gotti, and destroy it. Instead, he parked it in front of a fire hydrant in Brooklyn's Canarsie neighborhood and went to sleep. Police found it 2 days after the heist with his fingerprints inside. On December 18th, 1 week after the robbery, DeSimone and Sepe went to Edwards' apartment in Morningside Heights. and shot him 5 times in the head and chest. It was Sepe's first confirmed kill in the post-Lufthansa cleanup. It would not be his last. Over the next 7 months, Burke eliminated anyone he believed could connect him to the robbery or who he suspected might talk to investigators. Martin Krugman, the bookmaker who had brought the tip to Hill in the first place, disappeared on January 6, 1979. Burke had promised Krugman a $500,000 share of the stolen money. He killed him rather than pay it. Krugman's body was never found. Louis Cafora and his wife disappeared. Joe Manry and Robert McMahon were found shot to death in a car in Brooklyn. In total, at least 9 people, directly or tangentially connected to the heist, were murdered in the months that followed it. When investigators later compiled the full accounting, the number of people killed or who vanished in connection with the heist reached at least 16. Sepe survived all of it. He was one of the very few crew members who participated in the heist itself and was not killed by Burke in the aftermath. The reason, according to multiple accounts, was simple. Sepe was too useful. He was helping carry out the cleanup. He was one of the men doing the killing, not one of the men being killed. As long as there was more work to be done, Sepe was protected. But the protection was not unlimited. And Sepe, whose cocaine habit was burning through money at a rate that his criminal income could not sustain, began making decisions that put him in danger from a different direction entirely. Sometime in the months before his death, in the summer of 1984, Sepe robbed a drug trafficker who was affiliated with the Lucchese family, not a stranger, not an outsider. A connected dealer whose money and cocaine belonged, in the logic of that world, to the organization. Sepe took thousands of dollars in cash and a quantity of cocaine. He kept it. He thought perhaps that his history with the crew and his years of service would protect him. He was wrong. On July 18th, 1984, 2 men with silenced pistols came to the basement apartment at 8861 20th Avenue in Bath Beach, Brooklyn, where Sepe lived with Joanna Lombardo. Sepe was in the front room. Before he could say anything, before he could ask them to spare his girlfriend, they put 3 bullets into his head. Then they walked into the sleeping alcove where Joanna Lombardo was asleep. One of the gunmen put the barrel of his silenced pistol into her open mouth and pulled the trigger. She never woke up. She was in her early 20s. She had no criminal record. She died because she was in the room. Angelo Sepe was 43 years old. He had 14 arrests. He had committed at least 2 documented murders for Jimmy Burke and participated in the most famous robbery in American history. He died because he stole from the wrong people, not from outsiders, from his own organization. That is the real death of Frankie Carbone. Not a frozen meat truck, not a coat that cost too much, 3 bullets in a basement, and a sleeping girl who never had a chance. But here is the question the movie raises, and the real story demands we answer. If Angelo Sepe was not the man in the meat truck, who was? His name was Richard Eaton. Richard Eaton is one of the most fascinating and almost entirely forgotten figures in the entire Lufthansa heist story. He was not a gangster in the traditional sense. He was a con artist, a scammer, and a frontman, a man who existed in the spaces between organized crime and legitimate business, making himself useful to both and fully trusted by neither. He had attended Notre Dame University on an athletic scholarship. He spoke fluent Spanish and Italian. He was well-dressed, educated, articulate, and completely amoral. He worked as a frontman for non-union garment sweatshops in Queens and Brooklyn with Lucchese family connections. He ran restaurants and clubs in Florida that served, among other purposes, as vehicles for laundering cash. After the Lufthansa heist, Burke funneled a portion of the stolen money through Eaton's Florida operations to be cleaned. Eaton did what he was paid to do. Then, according to investigators, he did something he was not paid to do. He had convinced Burke to invest $250,000 in a Florida cocaine deal that promised immense profit. Eaton kept the money for his own use. When Henry Hill later asked Burke about Eaton's whereabouts, observing that he hadn't been around in a while, Burke replied simply, "Don't worry about him. I whacked the fucking swindler out." In the world of organized crime, taking $250,000 from the most violent man in Queens is not a mistake you survive. It is a death sentence with a delay. Burke had Eaton killed. The body was found hog-tied and gagged on the floor of an abandoned tractor trailer in a garbage-strewn lot in Brooklyn, a stretch of wasteland locals called The Pit. It was children playing in the area who first discovered the corpse. The body had been there long enough that rigor mortis had set in completely. It took investigators more than 2 days before the coroner could perform the autopsy. When authorities searched Eaton's coat, they found a phone book hidden in the lining. In that phone book was Jimmy Burke's name and his home telephone number in Island Park, New York. The FBI used it as evidence. Burke was eventually convicted of Eaton's murder on the 19th of February, 1985. At sentencing, he protested to the court, "The bastard died of hypothermia." He was sentenced to 20 years to life, added on top of the 12 years he was already serving for fixing Boston College basketball games in 1978 and 1979. He died of lung cancer at the Roswell Park Cancer Institute in Buffalo, New York, on April 13th, 1996, at the age of 64, 12 years before he would have been eligible for parole. That is the frozen meat truck, not a mob enforcer who spent his whole life serving the crew. A con artist who scammed the wrong man out of $250,000 and was found by children in a Brooklyn lot on a winter morning. Scorsese took Richard Eaton's death and gave it to Angelo Sepe's character. He merged 2 men, 2 murders, 2 completely different stories into one 4-second image and a single line of narration. In purely cinematic terms, it works. It condenses the horror of the post-Lufthansa killing spree into one unforgettable image. It gives Frankie Carbone a death that the audience will never shake. It is masterful filmmaking. But here is what that choice costs you. It costs you Angelo Sepe's actual story. The 14 arrests starting at age 14, the pet turtles and stray rabbits in the apartment of a man who killed without remorse. The cocaine habit, consuming more than 2 grams a day. The decade of murders carried out loyally for Jimmy Burke. The decision to rob a connected dealer that ended everything. And Joanna Lombardo asleep in the next room who paid for a decision she had no part in making. It also costs you Richard Eaton's story, the educated con artist who attended Notre Dame on an athletic scholarship and made himself useful to organized crime, who laundered Lufthansa money through Florida restaurants, who convinced Burke to invest $250,000 in a cocaine deal, kept the money, and paid for it with his life, whose body in a truck gave the FBI the evidence that eventually put his own killer behind bars, whose coat specifically, the phone book sewn into its lining, provided the single piece of hard evidence that sent Jimmy Burke away for the rest of his life. 2 men, 2 murders, 2 stories that are each individually more disturbing and more complex than the composite the movie created. And both of them buried under 4 seconds of piano music and a lie about thawing a body out for an autopsy. The Lufthansa Heist aftermath killed at least 9 people directly. If you count Joanna Lombardo, who had no involvement in any of it, the number is higher. If you count Teresa Ferrara, Tommy DeSimona's mistress and FBI informant, pulled out of a diner on February 10th, 1979 with the promise of making $10,000, found dismembered in a New Jersey inlet 4 months later, the number is higher still. None of the money stolen that December morning was ever recovered. Not $1, not 1 piece of jewelry. Law enforcement tracked the heist for decades. Henry Hill's eventual cooperation with the government produced more than 50 criminal convictions, making him one of the most consequential mob informants in American history. In 2014, Vincent Asaro of the Bonanno family was arrested in connection with the robbery at the age of 78. He was acquitted of all charges on the 12th of November 2015. No one has ever been convicted specifically for the Lufthansa robbery itself. The money is gone. The people who took it are either dead or in graves. the government knows about but cannot mark publicly. And the most famous image of the heist's aftermath, the frozen man in the meat truck, belongs to a man whose name most people who have seen the film a dozen times could not tell you. Richard Eaton. His name was Richard Eaton. Angelo Sepe is buried in New York. His death and Joanna Lombardo's death alongside him remain officially unsolved. The Lucchese family members believed responsible for their murders were never charged. In the logic of organized crime, 2 silenced pistols in a basement apartment on a July morning in Brooklyn are simply the cost of taking what does not belong to you. No trial, no charges, no marker. And that more than any frozen meat truck, more than any 4 seconds of piano music is the real horror of Frankie Carbone's story, not the image Scorsese chose. The reality he could not fit on screen. A man who spent his entire adult life committing violence for an organization that killed him the moment he became inconvenient. A sleeping girl who died because she was in the wrong room. A con artist whose body in a truck gave the FBI the evidence they needed to convict his killer. And a robbery so large and so perfectly executed that nearly 50 years later, not $1 of it has ever been found.